Okay, we seem to have settled down to about 79. I'm certain other people will join us later, so we'll make a start. Okay. Right, this is our fourth series of webinars, and most of you know I'm Bill Stockdale. I'm chairman of Thornbury Street History Group. And tonight, I'm really pleased and honoured to be able to introduce Professor Richard Hingley, who's going to be talking about rivers and ritual in Roman central Britain. If you remember, Richard did something for us last year, and there was a lot of interest in that. So this is the second instalment from Richard. Now, as always, if you've got any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. Don't use chat unless you have to. You can say hello if you want to use chat. And as always, we're time limited. I think Richard's talk's about 40 minutes, so there will be time at the end for questions. We'll try and get every question answered, but we might not get everyone done. So we'll do our very, very best for you. Okay, I'll hand you over to Richard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's very nice to be invited back to talk to you again. I'm going to talk about rivers and ritual in Roman central Britain. And I'm really thinking about the Roman military campaigns. I'm talking again about some material that I've addressed in a book I published. It came out about a year and a half ago called Conquering the Ocean. And this is available as a hardback at the moment. It's not too expensive. It's a bit cheaper than most academic books, and it's actually a fairly accessible book aimed at the general public. But it's coming out in paperback next April, so the cost of the paperback will be a bit cheaper. And I'm just going to look at another theme because the previous time I was talking to this group, I was talking about Roman roads, and perhaps, people are fascinated by roads. But I suppose one of the things I'd say is, the roads are really important, but the water is probably, in the case of Britain, more important. Now, if you have a background in Roman archaeology at all, you probably won't have heard that much about how the Romans perceived water. And I'm going to talk about that. And I should say, having lived in Scotland for 10 years and lived in northeastern England for 24 years, I know that people down at the part of the country I used to live in think Northern England is Northern Britain. But to me and my ex-friends and colleagues in Scotland particularly, Northern Britain is north of Edinburgh and Glasgow. And I'm talking about central Britain. And in the terms I'm talking about, central Britain probably extends from Yorkshire up to the sort of Edinburgh-Glasgow line. So I'm talking about the landscape of the Roman frontiers. And here we have Hadrian's Wall, a slide of Hadrian's Wall, which is almost the core of my talk, really, because I'm going to end up with Hadrian's Wall. But I want to explain why I would consider Hadrian's Wall as deeply tied into Roman concepts of water, and particularly the Roman concept of the ocean. Now, I want to talk briefly about water and the meaning of water in the elite Roman mind. So I'm talking about the sort of really important senior Romans. There are influential women in the Roman Empire, but most of these people are male. And, the Roman emperors, famous Roman emperors, I'm going to talk about a number of Roman emperors, senior commanders. And actually, these ideas about water and the meaning of water probably aren't restricted to the very, very senior people in the Roman military and the Roman administration. They're quite widespread. And they may spread down, the social hierarchy to people who are not that privileged. Even, some of the population of Britain, I think, adopt some of these ideas in the Roman period. And I'm going to start, if you've been to the city of Rome, one of the magnificent Roman monuments in Rome is Trajan's Column. Now, Trajan's Column dates to the late 1st century AD. So Trajan was one of the really successful military Roman emperors. And Trajan wasn't so interested in Britain. Quite an area of Britain was under Roman control by this time. And we're going to go back in a moment and look at the earlier periods of the conquest of Roman Britain. But Trajan really wanted to campaign elsewhere, and he was a military emperor. And one of his major victories was to incorporate a new province, a new territory into the Roman Empire. And this was Dacia. Now, Dacia was beyond the River Danube. It's now Romania. Most of Dacia falls within the modern country of Romania and sort of central to Eastern Europe. And if you go to Trajan's column, if you stand at the base of the column, at the start of the action, so what happens on Trajan's column is we have the campaigns Trajan led into Dacia to conquer this new territory mapped out in the column. But right at the base of the column, we have the scene I've got on my slide here. You can see the column on the right. So on the left of the slide, we have a giant bearded figure with long flowing hair. And you can see the Roman legionary soldiers, I'm sure, to his right, and some boats underneath the soldiers who are marching. And what this represents is a temporary bridge which Trajan built over the River Danube. And what we're seeing here, the Danube is over a kilometer wide at this point. I actually visited this location 3 or 4 years ago, and it's a very impressive river. That's why this god is so large, because this figure of the River Danube, this is a god of the River Danube. And he's large because the River Danube is large. I need to emphasize there's been some damage to the column here because he's actually coming out of the water. So under his body, he's reclining on a flowing river, which is the Danube. And he's helping Trajan soldiers go across a bridge. So Trajan, in order to successfully campaign in Dacia to win this new province for the Roman Empire, has to have the support of the River Danube as a god. And the Romans, a lot of Romans actually believed in divinities. I mean, it's hard for us to understand today, perhaps, but unless you're very religious, and it's a very different religion from what you'll probably believe in, a lot of Romans did actually believe these spirits had a lot of power over their destinies and their success in war. So Trajan will have sacrificed to this god. And what he's trying to do is get the submission of the god to aid in his conquests. And the god here is keeping the river calm, I think, so the soldiers can go over, campaign, conquer the territory, and everything's stable. Now, I am going to talk about Britain. I'm not going to talk further about Dacia. But if we look at Britain, we can see we've got water spirits in Britain. Water spirits of various sort exist in all areas of the Roman Empire. Britain's just one example. But there's a sort of hierarchy, and in a way, what is significant about Britain is that the most senior, the oldest of all the water spirits is particularly associated in the Roman mind with Britain, because we have Oceanus here on the left. Oceanus is a Greek god, a Titan. He dates to the origins of the world in Greek thought. He's one of the original divinities, and he was the god of the ocean. There are gods of the land too in Greek religion, and the Romans adopted a lot of things from the Greeks, and the worship of Oceanus was one of these. Now, if you want to look at Oceanus on Roman imagery, Oceanus has crab claws sprouting out of his head. And I hope you can see that on this rather magnificent mosaic from Verulamium, which is a Roman town just north of London at St. Albans. So a mosaic showing Oceanus, the most ancient of river gods. Now, also on the slide, we have 2 more images from sites in Britain. And I'm going to look at these a bit more as the talk goes on. But top right, we have a river god, or perhaps 2 river gods, as we'll see, from the Roman fort at Chesters on Hadrian's Wall. And at the bottom, on the right, we've got a nymph, a female water goddess called Coventina from the Roman fort at Carabruff on Hadrian's Wall, which is quite close to Chester's Roman fort. So Coventina and this other god the river god, who represents the Tyne, are sort of quite near neighbours. Now, if we follow this through, Britain has a particular significance in the Roman mind. And you can see on the slide why this is, because the map here is a representation from the work of a Greek geographer called Strabo. And Strabo describes the world. I mean, Strabo is a rough contemporary, slightly later than Julius Caesar. And I'm going to talk about Julius Caesar in a moment. But Strabo describes the world, as the Romans know it, as a giant world island. And you can see this here. So the Romans inhabit the area around the Mediterranean Sea on the left of the world island. They know a certain amount about the lands going east down to India. They have good contacts with people to the east. They know that Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC actually campaigned right into India. And he took large areas into his empire centuries before the Romans start expanding. So the Romans know a lot about the eastern area. They don't know so much, when we start our story here, about the areas to the north, into what is now Germany and to the British Isles. And Britain is a sort of remarkable, distant territory to the Romans, a place they know very little about. Now, I've taken a bit of text from my book here, which you can read. But what I argue in the book, and this is based on a whole series of observations made by other people, is that conquering Britain was a religious as much as a military objective. The significance of Britain really relates quite substantially to its relationship to the ocean. Now, if you look at this map, Strabo describes all these lands, and Britain, the Romans overestimated the size of Britain, but Britain was the largest island known to the Romans. And also, the Romans came to know that the Atlantic Ocean was particularly rough. So Oceanus actually becomes particularly associated in the period I'm talking about with that sort of northwestern Atlantic area, where ships from the Mediterranean had real problems because the Mediterranean Sea is quite calm. Well, it's very calm in relation to the Atlantic Sea. So how do you conquer people in the British Isles in a sea that's so violent, remembering that Oceanus is a god? So you need Oceanus's support. If you have trouble in the sea, Oceanus is probably angry with you and you need to placate him. So you need to control him. Now, the tale I'm going to tell you is reconstructed from fragments of classical texts and archaeological finds. So it's a sort of tale I've elaborated on the basis of a lot of fragments, if you want. And I'm going to start with Julius Caesar. And you may know a certain amount about Julius Caesar. Most people in England know that he came to Britain in 55 and 54 BC. I've sort of paraphrased and changed the quotation in Latin from his writings. He came, saw, and went away again, really, in the case of Britain, because he came to Britain twice, and he was really exploring. There's no real indication he had any ambitions of conquering any territory. He wanted the submission of British peoples and British military leaders, and he wanted booty. Now, one thing that's very significant, I think, and actually interestingly, although I've written about this in my book, I discovered another article 2 days ago doing a bit of research for this paper, which makes this point better probably than I did in my book. Caesar is fascinated by the idea of British pearls. And when Caesar talks about wealth in Britain, it may actually be the pearls that he's thinking about. Now, we still have pearls in Britain today. The British Pearl Association actually market pearls from British waters. And obviously pearls, you can get them from the sea, but in Britain today, at least, the pearls are from oysters that live in rivers. Caesar basically dedicates in 46 BC a cuirass, so a breastplate made of pearls, British pearls, in the Temple of Venus Genitrix in Rome. And you've got an image of that temple on this slide, and some pearls too. And a Roman author called Pliny tells us about this. He also tells us that British pearls weren't very high quality. Now, I think some of the modern British pearls probably are very high quality. The British pearls weren't as good as the pearls from the East. So pearls came from India too. Caesar was fighting a little battle with another of his contemporaries, a very dominant military commander called Pompey, who'd had a major triumph over a decade before and brought lots of wealth, including pearls, back from the East. But Caesar particularly likes British pearls. And the reason for this, it's suggested by this author, Marlene Flory, and by several other people, and I picked this up myself, is because these pearls are deeply associated with Britain, which is set in the ocean. Now, all rivers and springs are children of Oceanus in Greek and Roman thought. So if you have pearls from Britain, they have this deep association with the ocean. And that may be why Caesar actually traveled to Britain. He was involved in large-scale conquest in Gaul, or what is now France, and he just comes to Britain during his campaigning. And perhaps the real reason he wants to go to Britain is because he's making a claim to divine ancestry. Now, his family, the Julii, claimed descent from Venus, and you can follow through the logic of that yourself. Caesar is obsessed by being divine. Now, the Emperor Claudius, who leads the invasion of Britain about a century after Caesar, so Caesar goes away and contact remains between Britain and Rome. Claudius leads the invasion of Britain in AD 43. Claudius, the BBC still have the old series of I, Claudius available. It's a very, violent, disturbing series in a way, but it's very well produced. It's not history, it's a drama, modern drama, based on some classical texts. But you'll know if you've watched that Claudius is an emperor, one of the early emperors, and his position isn't very stable because the Roman Senate, the elite in Rome, don't really respect him. So what Claudius does is to lead the invasion of Britain to really build his identity as a very important Roman emperor. And this works really because Britain has this semi-divine image in the Roman mind. So Britain is a great place for Claudius to make his reputation. And the map here, which comes from my book, just shows the early conquests. So here, under Caesar and Claudius, we're just dealing with the southeast of Britain. We'll come on to central Britain shortly. Now, Claudius is rewarded in various ways for the conquest of Britain. Claudius commands the conquest of Britain, and he comes to Britain and to an extent leads the conquest for a short period. He doesn't do a lot of, he probably doesn't fight at all. He's just a figurehead. But the Senate in Rome proclaimed that he should have a triumphal arch to commemorate his conquest in Britain. So in Rome, there was this monumental arch of Claudius. This is decades before Trajan. And we've got a reconstruction of this arch. It doesn't survive today. The reconstruction's by Chris Unwin. And we have some fragments. She's reconstructed it in color here. And we have a large section of the inscription that goes across the top of the arch here. And it tells us in some detail that Claudius received the submission of a number of kings, a number of rulers in Britain. So the people of Britain at this time are divided into various small-scale peoples or tribes. They each have a leader. And a number of these leaders, possibly 11, surrendered to Claudius. And the other thing this tells us, this inscription, is that Claudius conquered lands beyond the ocean. Again, as I've been emphasizing, that idea of lands beyond the ocean is vital to Claudius's success. Now, another thing about this, which I find fascinating, I have been to the site recently. There's very little to see where the Arch of Claudius was located in Rome, but the arch originally was part of the aqueduct, one of the aqueducts, which carried water in from the north into the city of Rome. So if you look at the reconstruction drawing here, water flowed along the aqueduct through the upper part of Claudius's triumphal arch. So Claudius is laying claim to conquering land beyond the ocean, but his arch is actually controlling water, which is flowing into Rome. Claudius is a master of both land and water in Roman ideology. Now, if we look at another representation of Claudius and his activities in Britain on the right, this image from a wonderfully named site called Aphrodisias in Turkey is part of a temple which commemorates the emperors. So it commemorates a range of emperors, including Claudius. And the image on the right shows Claudius effectively attacking and overpowering Britannia. And this one is quite well known. You may have seen this before. Britannia here is in the position, she's in the sort of, she's reclining like a sea god or a nymph associated with spring. And she's got garments which are reminiscent of water. And it struck me earlier today, I think Britannia is being portrayed effectively as a nymph here. But the one I really wanted to show you is less famous, I think, in Britain at least, on the left. And it has Claudius as a divine hero receiving the tributes of land and sea. So the figure on the right here has two tails, you may be able to see, and is a spirit of the sea. And on the left, we have the spirit of the land. So Claudius has this major triumph in Roman terms over Oceanus and the lands beyond ocean. Now I'm going to move on now and I'm going to jump some way, but if you're interested in these ideas, do get hold of a copy of my book, because there are some other stories that I could tell you. I haven't got time, but I'm going to move on to a period 3.5 decades after Claudius, or almost 4 decades after Claudius first brings Roman forces into Britain. And at this stage, in about AD 81, we've actually reached central Britain. And actually the Romans have reached northern Britain by this date, AD 81. I will come back to central Britain shortly. And the governor Agricola is in charge of the Roman military. Agricola was sent by one of the emperors who succeeds Claudius. This is Domitian, to conquer lands further north in Britain. And there's just one quotation here that I think is fundamentally significant. And you've got a map here showing what Agricola is doing in the early 80s AD. The Roman author Tacitus, in his famous work, the Agricola, writes a biography of his father-in-law. So Tacitus, who's a really famous Roman author, writes a biography of his father-in-law, the great military commander Agricola. And Agricola has conquered large areas of Britain in the late 70s and 80s. Tacitus says, this is a Latin translation, not by me, and it's the best approximation I could get to what Tacitus seems to be saying, because you can translate Latin in different ways, and I won't talk about that particularly. You can ask me later on if you want. We're told, if the spirit of the army and the glory of the Roman name had permitted it, a frontier would have been found within Britain itself, for the Firth of Clyde and Forth, Firths of Clyde and Forth, carried far inland by the tides of the opposing seas, are separated by a narrow neck of land. So what this is saying to me is that ocean, divinity, runs inland up the rivers, Clyde and Forth, and we have a narrow neck of land, which, according to Tacitus, is now securely held by garrisons, so by Roman military units, And the whole sweep of land on the nearer side, so to the south in the Roman territory, was secured. The enemy had been pushed back as if into a different island. So the idea here is, I think, in Tacitus's writing, and this probably comes from contemporary accounts of what Agricola was doing and thinking at the time. The idea is that effectively they haven't reached the north coast, they haven't incorporated the whole island, but they've established a garrison which has the effect of having reached Oton. After this, Agricola campaigned, so he moved across this temporary frontier in AD 82 and campaigned right up the east coast of Scotland, almost as far as the modern city of Inverness. And you can see the movement of the army here. The Romans then fall back, and eventually, after a couple of decades, they fall back roughly to the line of Hadrian's Wall, which we're going to look at next. So we're going to think about Hadrian in Britain. Before we think about Hadrian, if you know very much about Hadrian's Wall, it's usually argued we have a previous frontier along the line of Hadrian's Wall called the Staingate. This is during Trajan's reign. So we looked at Trajan in Dacia earlier. When Trajan's campaigning in Dacia, we have a line of garrisons and a road along the Staingate. But Hadrian's famous in Britain, particularly for his wall, obviously. Hadrian also visited Britain. He was another emperor, along with Claudius, who actually came to Britain. And we know he came to Britain in AD 122. Usually, you would be told that Hadrian's Wall was constructed from AD 122. Now, these days, most archaeologists and ancient historians, I think, believe that Hadrian commanded that the wall should be built in either AD 120 or AD 121, because he was going to come to Britain. He toured a lot of the Roman provinces, and basically he wanted to come to Britain to actually inspect the work underway. So probably when we were celebrating the 1900th anniversary of the building of Hadrian's Wall last year, we should have done it in 2020 or 2021. Okay, it doesn't really matter. It's a grand monument. What we could celebrate last year, I actually gave a talk on this in Hexham, is Hadrian's visit to Britain. It was the 1900th anniversary of Hadrian's visit to Britain, and it was a major event for an emperor to come to Britain. Julius Caesar had been to southern Britain, Claudius had been to southern Britain. None of the emperors had been up to the north of England, what is now the north of England. Now, Hadrian in Britain, we don't really know what he did. The historical accounts don't give us any detail. We can be absolutely certain he will have been to the northern frontier. So he will have been up to the line of Hadrian's Wall, whether the building of the wall had started or not. And one very direct hint, or I think it's more than a hint really, is the name that is attributed to Newcastle upon Tyne in the Roman period, because the Roman period name for Newcastle is Pons Oleus, which means Hadrian's Bridge. Now, if you go down to the Swing Bridge in Newcastle, just to the side of the Swing Bridge, we believe was the location of Hadrian's Bridge. And almost certainly Hadrian visited this bridge quite probably when it was under construction. The reason for this is effectively these two altars that we can see here and the place name. Now, there's another famous bridge. I keep referring to the city of Rome. There's another Hadrian's Bridge in Rome, which is one of the bridges that survive if you wander around the city of Rome. And the core of this bridge, on the top right of my slide in Rome, is actually Hadrian's original bridge. In the case of Hadrian's Bridge at Newcastle, we have bits, fragments, but the main thing that survives from that bridge are these two altars. So altars are things that Romans carried out sacrifices on And these altars are dedicated to Oceanus, the god I've been talking about, and Neptune. Now, Neptune, I haven't mentioned, Neptune was a Roman god, particularly of rivers. He had associations with the sea too. So Neptune and Oceanus are sort of alternative gods. Neptune is a Roman god, Oceanus was a Greek god, but they sort of have overlapping identities. Now, we think that one of the explanations, which I think is interesting, is that Hadrian led a sacrifice at the site of this bridge to Oceanus and Neptune. And Hadrian was clearly drawing on Oceanus and his activities in Britain, because this coin at the bottom right is a coin of Hadrian, and it has Oceanus on the other side. And if you've got good eyes, you may be able to see that this god of the sea, who has crab claws on the top of his head, is holding an anchor. And Oceanus's altar from Hadrian's Bridge on the left here has the same anchor. Now, Hadrian made quite, or his moneyers made quite a big business out of Hadrian dominating the ocean. Here we have another coin of Hadrian, and on this coin, Hadrian is shown as the semi-divine hero Hercules, and he's standing on top of and dominating a river god. Now, interestingly, although this seems to be a river god on some of Hadrian's coins, an ancient historian called Fabio Barri has pointed out that if you look in detail at some of these coins, this god that's being dominated by Hercules or Hadrian has crab claws. So Hadrian is dominating the ocean. Now, I just want to look at Hadrian's Wall and make a few points which may sound slightly mad in a way, but they're very deeply connected with the topic I've been talking about. So if you look at the wall, I haven't got time to talk about the nature of the wall or the structure of the wall, but I hope you know something about it. If you look at the wall, I've been talking about Newcastle, which is towards the east end of the wall. I'm just going to look very briefly at Wall's End, which is the east end of the wall. I'm going to look at Chester's, which is one of the forts along the wall, Carabrough and Carlisle. So Carabrough and Carlisle are also forts along the wall. Firstly, I'll emphasize a point I made earlier when I was talking about Agricola and his campaigns in northern Britain, that Hadrian's Wall is like what Agricola was doing on the Fourth Clyde line, very riverine. You've got the Tyne running right behind the eastern length of Hadrian's Wall, and you've got other rivers to the west. So Hadrian's Wall, like Agricola's frontier for the north, is built with the use of the ocean and the tides running up the rivers that go into the ocean. But if we look at Hadrian's Wall, at Wall's End, Paul Bidwell has suggested that we had a victory monument on a stone mole, which runs out into the Tyne. And we have two fragments of inscription from this victory monument. And these effectively say what I've just said about the wall. They tell us that the barbarians have been scattered by the Romans and the security of the province restored, and that Hadrian had added a frontier between the two shores of the ocean. So this is effectively saying, the Latin is rather different, but it's a common motif. It's reminiscent of what Tacitus writes about Agricola's temporary frontier. Now, if we look at Chester's, and I've introduced this river god before, this god represents the River North Tyne. And Paul Bidwell has suggested that originally this statue, which was found within the fort, actually was in a shrine on the bridge that carried Hadrian's Wall across the North Tyne. Now, Fabio Barri, whose work I really like, has noticed there's a second god beneath the dominant god here with a bigger head. So there are two river gods. And he suggested that the second god might be Oceanus. I think it could be the main course of the Tyne, because the Tyne splits close to Chester's. So it could be both rivers rather than Oceanus. It doesn't really matter. Oceanus is the father of all water sources. So at that point, it doesn't really matter. but another watery context on Hadrian's Wall. If we go to Carlisle, and this one isn't very well known, Tully House Museum have this stone in their store, and I hope one day when they redesign the Roman gallery again, they might take it out and display it, because here we have the head of a river god again on a building stone that probably came from the bridge across the River Eden at Carlisle. And finally, probably my favorite divinity, really, when it comes down to, is this nymph, Coventina, at Carabruff, Roman fort on Hadrian's Wall. You can see her here. We have several representations of Coventina, who, in a way, conceptually is a bit similar to that image of Britannia being attacked by Claudius. But Coventina is a sort of noble goddess. You know, she has a lot of worshippers. She's not attacked by anybody. She had a small temple just to the west of the Roman forts at Carabruff, and the waters from her spring, so she's a spring goddess, ran down to the south and joined the Tyne. So I've gone through a few of the sort of watery associations of Hadrian's Wall, and what I've been doing here is trying to construct a narrative to explain one thing that is deeply significant about Britain in the Roman mind: its oceanic status and its relationship to this ancient Titan, who is such a big figure in Roman mythology. I think that may, to an extent, explain why the Romans spent so much time and resource conquering Britain, and also perhaps it might help to explain the scale of Hadrian's Wall. Now, in summary, Britannia, the Roman name for Britain, had a special status, and it was particularly linked into the location of the mainland, or the islands in general, in relation to Roman concepts of Oceanus. And this really affected what the Romans did in Britain, right from their first exploration under Julius Caesar to the end of Roman rule in the early 5th century. So hence the military campaigning stressed the ocean and the domination of rivers. The land that was conquered in Britain was a testimony to Roman triumph over Oceanus. The lands are beyond ocean in Roman concepts. So Julius Caesar was fascinated by pearls, and I would argue, and I'm drawing other people here, perhaps he really wanted to come to Britain to get pearls because of his family's claim to divine status, linking them to Venus, the goddess Venus. Claudius needed a triumph, and his reign is sort of dominated by ideas of his control of water and ocean. Agricola was playing around with ideas of ocean in his campaigns, and Hadrian's Wall, to me, is an oceanic frontier. Its scale represents the fact that the Romans didn't need to conquer the whole of the mainland because they could build a grand structure in place of ocean. And I should say, just in summary, that this goes on. So I've finished in AD 120 or so, 130. But when we go into later Roman times, other Roman emperors come to Britain to campaign. And if you look at the history of Roman coinage, almost all the emperors who actually produce coins showing Oceanus, who has a particular connection with Britain, are emperors who came to Britain. I think the only exception is Nero. And I kind of wonder if Nero had Oceanus in his coins because they did finally defeat Britannia. Sorry, they did finally defeat Boudicca during Boudicca's rebellion during Nero's reign. So perhaps he didn't have a triumph, but perhaps he had some sort of flawed victory in Britain. So Britain is special in the Roman mind because of its oceanic status. And also, I have to say, and I haven't covered this really, because of its perceived barbarity. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was another really interesting talk. Thank you, Richard. Can I just ask, why was Britain of interest? Because of its barbarity?
Well, that's an interesting question. The Romans, to an extent, it's quite hard to answer this question in a way because of the way within the British Empire, the British picked up some stories and ideas from the Romans. So I have to be a bit careful what I say because I tend to be very critical of imperialism generally. If you want my sort of stance on imperialism, I'm not an admirer of the British Empire. I mean, it's not a simple thing. You know, I wouldn't condemn everybody who's involved in British imperialism, but I'm not a great admirer. And we're a post-imperial generation. The Romans had this ideology, which the British picked up, which was that they considered they took civilization to people. Now, if you imagine that, you know, you have a society in which you claim you're taking civilization to people, the more barbaric those people are in your view, the more of a gift you're giving them. I mean, my problem with imperialism, if you want, I'm answering this question very swiftly, is that usually the people who say they're trying to bring civilization to other people are actually trying to dominate them and remove their resources and enslave them. So if you want, it's what academics call a piece of ideology. But the Romans, you know, Britain and Germany are really the most barbaric places the Romans can reach.
Right. So there might have been something in that they were quite a challenge because they were perceived as so barbaric.
Yeah, but I think you know, what we as archaeologists have tended to do is we study pre-Roman people in Britain from a different perspective because for centuries people intellectually were dominated by the idea that the Britons were actually barbarians, but they could build very complex round buildings. They had a very evolved agricultural system. I mean, a lot of people today actually believe Iron Age people lived more in keeping with their environment and had a more sustainable agricultural system, which today, I mean, you know, who do you actually think would be better if you want to judge it? The Romans were militaristic, they had a dictatorship, they dominated people and enslaved people. The Iron Age people lived more in keeping with the landscape, you know, had a smaller scale society, and they also enslaved people and they killed people too. It's not a simple thing, but I think on the whole, what the Romans tell us about the Britons, we can't really trust at all. You know, we have to try and look at the archaeological information to try and work out what we actually think about the people who are living in Britain before the Romans.
Right, I'll read you a couple more questions. Paul McAndrew says, could you talk a little about Antoninus and his river death and also about Verbeia in Ilkley?
Antoninus and his river death. Which Antoninus are we talking about?
Antoninus. Sorry, I probably didn't pronounce that right.
Yeah, that's not really a topic I know too much about. I'm often very honest. And the other point too, I mean, I'm a specialist on Iron Age Roman Britain. My knowledge about areas of Britain is, you know, limited to the areas I actually know. So Ilkley, I mean, I've been to Ilkley once. And I'm sorry, I'm not answering your question. Antoninus, I need to know more about. I mean, Roman society is full of people. People do die in rivers. I don't know whether it's a military campaign or somebody who actually got washed away, but it's not something. I'm also not a classicist. I'm an archaeologist, so I use ancient history, but in a fairly directed manner. I'm sorry. That's. I think that's the first set of questions that have floored me in the two talks I've given.
Right. Well, we'll move on to Hilary Brindley, who asks, did the Romans adopt local Celtic river names or did they invent new ones?
Yeah, that's a very good question. They almost always adopted local names. In fact, there are some Roman period imported names in Britain, but the vast majority of place names, not just river names, local names. And I think the river names are a fascinating topic. I didn't have time to talk about them, but a lot of the river names are names of gods or goddesses. So, I mean, to an extent, we know some of them relate to divine spirits. There's a shrine in southern Britain which is dedicated to a nymph called Sununa. This is quite a recent discovery. Somebody found some religious objects which had the name of this goddess on them. And Sununa is actually a nymph. So the river that comes from this shrine almost certainly was called by the same name, Senuna. And there's another river in another part of southern Britain which has that name, Senuna. So the Romans adopted a lot of things, and the river names, I think invariably, are local names that predate the Romans. One thing that tells us, which may be one of the things that's behind your question, is that the Romans also adopt those divinities. So the local divinities of the springs and the rivers are adopted into the Roman pantheon. And Coventina, I didn't have time to say this, if you know much about Coventina at Carabraf, there's a big debate about Coventina. Some people suggest she was a goddess worshipped on the continent who was brought to Britain. I suspect very strongly, and several people who work on the name, so people who are experts on names, I'm not an expert on so-called Celtic names, suspect she was actually a local goddess, and her worship actually originated at Carabraf. So yeah, I mean, the rivers are really interesting. The names are really interesting. We know quite a lot of Roman river names, but we don't know anything like probably the vast majority, the local rivers, the small rivers. We have no idea what they were called. From time to time, people find new spring goddesses. So a statue turns up or a treasure which names a goddess.
Right. David Breer, I'll read this one. 2 points re Agricola on which Prof Hingley might like to comment. When Tacitus describes Agricola establishing a frontier on the Antonine line, is he implying that Roman troops held the land, but that the two arms of the ocean held and defended, as it were, Britain to the west and east? And secondly, Agricola's fleet sailed round Britain. Was this Domitian conquering the ocean, even if it's not stated for obvious reasons?
Those are both good points. The second one about sailing around the ocean, the fact they sail around the ocean, I mean, it was shown on my map too. Actually, Tacitus does talk about that in relation to the domination of Britain, because by dominating the ocean, you know, the Romans have this navy called the Classis Britannica, and by actually sailing around in the ocean, they're dominating the ocean, and therefore, to an extent, Tacitus claims they conquered the far north of Britain. I mean, that's largely on the basis of the fact they managed to sail around the top. It's clear from Tacitus's writings about Agricola, they didn't actually manage to, I mean, he says they reached the north coast, but they might have reached the north coast in Grampian. They didn't reach the north coast right up on the north coast. They never conquered the highlands. And they make an alliance with a ruler in the Orkney Islands, which is also deeply important because basically that means they've got an alliance with somebody beyond the north coast of Britain. The first point I've sort of lost again. Can you repeat?
I'll just 2 points about Agricola. When Tacitus describes Agricola establishing a frontier line on the Antonine line, is that implying that Roman troops held the land, but that the two arms of the ocean held Britain to the west and east?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting issue. I think a lot of, you could take it that way technically, but I think a lot of Roman ideas about ocean and rivers, they do know oceans and rivers aren't, you know, the divinities aren't going to appear and take action. I think a lot of it is sort of concepts that are used to communicate military ideas. So the Romans, as I said, control the sea because they have the navy. So actually what happens is they build the garrisons. This happens with Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall too. They build the garrisons along the frontier line and their navy controls the sea to either side. And I think, you know, these arguments about the ocean having a role in it are to do with Roman concepts of power. So they dominate the ocean. I don't know, there's a big debate in classics about whether, you know, a lot of these Romans actually believed in divinities. Right. Okay. But when you're claiming victory, I mean, if you're a Roman emperor or somebody like Agricola, who's a senior military man who wants a career, I mean, Tacitus sort of infers Agricola might have gone back to Rome and become emperor. You know, basically, how much more powerful can you be than somebody who dominates a god?
Well, this leads well on to Janet Waite's question, which is, didn't the Romans fear the wrath of the gods by depicting them being conquered?
Well, I think it's a complex thing. I mean, basically, yes, to an extent. I think a lot of this is actually not necessarily communicated as dominating the gods. I think it would be foolish for an emperor to, Claudius is receiving the submission of the land and sea, but the spirits who are actually on that Aphrodisias frieze giving tribute to Claudius, Oceanus isn't one of them. I mean, we don't know who the sea spirit is. Got two tails. I mean, it's an eastern sea being, but there are lots of spirits in the sea. I think, that image of on Trajan's column of the Danube is also interesting because they pay respect to these divinities. They sacrifice to the divinities to get their support in what they're doing. There's a terrible tragedy with the Roman Navy in when is it? I can't remember the exact date, but they've been campaigning in Germany. This is under Tiberius, so it's late 1st century BC. And they're coming back on the sea, and the Navy gets completely wrecked. And there's a lot of reflection in, well, we know two poets in Rome reflect on the anger of the gods. The Romans, have been foolish. And actually at that stage, one of the poets says, these lands beyond ocean are not our territory, the territory of the gods. So there's a lot of fear of the gods. But I think, again, if you think about it, Claudius would be claiming, and Hadrian would be claiming, I think, that they are dominating ocean, but through ocean support. And I don't know, there's coins of Hadrian with Hadrian dominating river gods and ocean. Might suggest something slightly different. But, coiners may be doing things that aren't particularly official ideology. And I don't know, the emperor himself probably wouldn't be involved in which images occur on the coins. So I think you're right. I mean, it's because ocean is such a dangerous thing. If you have the sort of, they get used to the Atlantic coast from Julius Caesar onwards, so they modify their boats and they get used to sailing around Britain. I'm sure they'll always have found the northwestern coast of Britain very, very difficult to navigate, and they almost certainly continue to patrol. They don't conquer the Highlands, but they almost certainly continue to patrol the coasts. But you need the support of the divinities. Dominating them perhaps is a bit of, perhaps I'm stressing that a bit too much, but it does come through to an extent. Perhaps you dominate the subsidiary spirits of the sea and the rivers more than you could dominate Oceanus. I think Oceanus is too powerful. And that's why Britain continues to be symbolically so important, because of Oceanus's significance, I think.
Right. Ellen Martin asks, did the indigenous barbarian Britons venerate water deities, as in springs and rivers? And did the Romans adopt those deities as they adopted local warrior hunter gods?
Yeah. I've already answered that a bit in one of my previous questions. We don't know too much about what people before the Romans come in worshipped in relation to springs and rivers, because they didn't write anything down. So, basically, when we know about water gods in Britain in the Roman period, it's because we have accounts. So, for instance, Sununa, who I mentioned earlier, who's this new water goddess that's turned up in the last 20 years in Hertfordshire, we know about her because we have some votive plaques, some metal plaques, which have Latin inscriptions naming this goddess. And certainly Sununa was an Iron Age goddess, because we've got prehistoric archaeology from that site. She's adopted, in terms of Romans adopting local gods in Britain, some of the people who worship these gods may have been Britons, because some Britons adopt Roman culture. So on Hadrian's Wall, we know the people who are worshipping Coventina are all soldiers, because they leave inscriptions, and they all come from the continent. But we have a lot of coins from Coventina as well, Carabruff, and it's been suggested some local people might be putting Roman coins into the well. We don't really know. But yeah, in the south, definitely they adopt local goddesses and gods, and they continue to worship them. To an extent, I wonder if sometimes they may actually manipulate the cults. On Hadrian's Wall, I showed you Coventina as well. If Coventina is a pre-Roman goddess, by building the fort there, you're dominating her spring. So perhaps you then don't let local people in. I mean, who knows? We really don't know. We can't discover the subtleties through the work we've been able to do there. But the site was dug in Victorian times, so if somebody went back and excavated it again, we might find some more definitive information, possibly.
Paul McAndrew has provided some more information about the guy whose name I mispronounced, I think. It says Antinius was Hadrian's lover, whom he elevated to godhood after he drowned in the Nile, apparently.
Oh, that's right. I mean, that's interesting. I do know something about that. Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I hadn't at all thought through an association. I mean, I suppose it would be interesting to look at the classical accounts. I mean, I know more about the statues of Hadrian's lover than actually about the historical context of what happened. I do remember that now you mention it. It would be interesting to see what the classical authors wrote about that. I don't know whether you know, but perhaps if Hadrian's challenging water gods or ocean, it's possible some people in Rome might have thought, it was a punishment for being too confident about your own military prowess. I mean, I'm very grossly speculating there because it's not my field, but that's an interesting point.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll once again, and I'll hand you back over to Bill. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pam. Richard, fabulous, fantastic. You've really done the business for us once again, and hopefully we might manage to get you back for a third time with our next series. I hope everybody did enjoy Richard's presentation. Let's have your feedback, please, and tell us what you might want us to talk about and what you don't want us to talk about. And I think that will help us tremendously moving forward. Right, moving on. Our next webinar is on Thursday, the 7th of December. Mark Newman is going to talk to us. Mark's from the National Trust, and he's going to talk to us about Benningborough Hall, what we did, what it all means, and what do we do next. And this is closely related to Thornsley Street History Group and our Roads to the Past project that we carried out there this year and part of last year. So that's close to our hearts. So please get yourself signed up for that. That would be great. Okay, still got a few copies of our history book. If you would like a copy, you can have a look on our website or give us a call, please, on 01845 527 717. That's 01845 527 717, and we will gladly sell one to you. Begging cap out now. We are self-funding. No lottery funding left. We're not looking to make a profit. We're just looking to break even and provide you with good quality speakers and exciting and interesting topics as well. So if you are able to give us a donation, that's great. And I'm going to say thank you to those who've already donated and also for the feedback that you've given us. We really do appreciate that. If you are able to make a donation, it's to Thornton Lee Street History Group, and our bank details, sort code is 206146, and the account number is 0342 9881. That's Thornton Lee Street History Group, sort code 206146, account number 0349 881. Okay, I'd like to thank all our viewers, actually, especially the international ones. And we've had people from Switzerland, from Ireland, from Italy, from Belgium, from Brazil, Jersey, United States and Canada, and there will be other countries as well. So thank you all very much for tuning in and making our webinars enjoyable. Okay, that's about all from me. So until our next webinar on Thursday the 7th, I'll ask you all to keep yourself safe and well. Good night.